Welcome back to Classic Business. It's almost 25 to 7 on this Monday. We're talking about minimum wages, and I've got employment, labour relations and employment law consultant Andrew Levy on the line with Raymond Parsons of the School of Business and Governance at Northwest University and Mike Schussler, Chief Economist at economist.co.za. And in studio, I've got NEDLAC Advisory Panel Chair, Professor Imran Valoya, and Gerhard Papenfus, Chief Executive of the National Employers Association of South Africa. Gerhard, I mean, as a representative almost of SMEs on this panel, what do you make of the concessions given to allow SMEs a further 12 months to adjust? And do you think small business can adjust without job losses?
I wish we could, South Africa could afford a wage, generally, of a much higher wage than this amount. I think it's still difficult for anyone to live on this amount of money, but the reality is we've got 9 million people that do not have work. As I was walking towards this building this afternoon, a young person asked me for money for bread. And I was thinking, if he approaches an employer and asks for a job, demanding 3,500, he's not going to get a job. And if he says, but I'm prepared to work for less, I've got no skills, I've never worked in my life, I've got no skills, no education, that will be impossible for that employer to employ him, and unless you break the law. And I tell you, on that basis, a lot of employers are going to break the law, and as you speak here, a lot of employers are already breaking the law in any event, because there are people that employers say, look, I don't really need you. It's happening on farms. I don't need you. This service you can render is not absolutely necessary, but I'll pay you something just to be here, and it's happening all the time. So they're breaking the law, they know they break the law, and they take the risk simply to help another person. Now, what is interesting here is that collective bargaining structures where employers and trade unions negotiate, these wages are generally much higher than this amount. Mike Schussler has mentioned figures in the metal industry. Now, just to use the metal industry as an example, that industry is the most expensive industry, and that industry is losing the most jobs. That industry has stagnated completely, and that shows the higher the wage, it definitely impacts on the sustainability of an industry. Where industries are less organized, the government used to, and up until now, used to come in and determine a wage by means of a sectoral determination. And that was done on the basis of many things. What are paid, what industries can afford. And these industries, some of them, like taxis, for instance, and retail and hospitality, they are paying a substantial figure below what's currently required, and an adjustment between 20 and 30% will have to be made between now and 2 years' time. And the question is, will they do that? If they do it, if some simply cannot, for instance, the security industry, you can't reduce personnel in the security industry. If you need 8 guards on a premises, then you need 8 guards. So they will simply have to incorporate the higher price into the arrangement with the client. In the case of retail, well, the price will be passed on to the commodity, and the consumer will pay it. And the same person that is now earning a bit more will pay more for food and will pay more for taxi fees. Somebody's got to pay for this. So, and then there's the other thing, is the 9 million. Why we're fighting against this thing is the most marginalized workers will be affected. Employers generally don't care about this. I mean, they can afford it, and some who can't will retrench. Where they can't retrench, they will increase the price of the commodity. But marginalized workers, those that not really need it, will suffer. And the 9 million that's standing outside and want a foot in the door, I think it will be extremely difficult for them to get a foot in the door. And the question is it right for the country to say you cannot get a job, even if you are prepared to work for less? You cannot get a job. Isn't that a bit criminal? If I'm prepared to work for less, why can't I do it? And don't just say the employer is abusing the situation. It's not that easy. Employers aren't so. It isn't true that employers are so reluctant to pay. There are many factors that's coming into play here, and so I do not know whether South Africa, with this rate of unemployment, can really afford this kind of arrangement. And in any event, nobody is happy about it. Kusadi is not happy about it. Nobody is happy.
That's sometimes when you get the best outcomes, when everyone is equally miserable about something. But in all seriousness, though, Raymond, and we've heard now the sort of SME perspective. You're a former head of BUSA. You're currently a lecturer. You've got a fairly good handle on our youth unemployment crisis. When it comes to youth employment, the panel noted that there are a host of policies currently in place to encourage youth employment. We've got the tax incentive, just one of them. And the panel also stated, and I'm quoting here, there is no evidence to suggest that the introduction of a national minimum wage will have any negative impact on this sector. Now, my first real job was largely unpaid for the first 3 months, followed by a stipend that would fall short of the national minimum wage. So just in my personal situation, that seems quite strange for the panel to say that there's no evidence. But what do you make of the impact that this might have on the youth?
Well, I think it goes broader than that. Although obviously youth unemployment is one of our major priorities. I think when we stand back and we look at this debate and listening to what my fellow panelists have said, I think there are two important points on the whole national minimum wage issue. And I don't have a problem with a row for a national minimum wage, but there are two issues here. The one is to make absolutely sure that you take the right decisions in such a way that the unintended consequences don't swamp the intended ones. And I think that's the first risk we face. The second is, this is an area for indeed pragmatism and not dogmatism. And I think there is a degree of flexibility built into the recommendations. But I think if we stand back and say, what's the big trade-off here? Well, firstly, I think we've got to understand that this national minimum wage debate is part of a bigger package. Although we're discussing it in isolation here, it's part of a process of saying, can we restructure the labour market in some way to make it less dysfunctional and less wringing of hands about high unemployment? One of them is this issue, of course, as you know, of whether there should be a secret ballot on strikes. This is all part of a deal. So one can't look at it in isolation, but to say, is this a price worth paying in order to get other concessions to make the labour market work better? The other issue is, yes, I think absolutely this debate is really showing up a very cruel dilemma in South Africa, that the recommended 3,500 is too low to be a living wage, but maybe too high to generate maximum employment. So I mean that is the dilemma that we face. So I've come to the conclusion, looking at the labour market and its dysfunctionalities, we've got to be very careful here. And though we may well draw conclusions, and rightly so, from experience in other countries which have been reasonably successful with their national minimum wages, the fact is there are some special factors in the South African situation that we need to take into account. If we get this wrong, we cannot reverse it. We're not just saying, well, we'll experiment, and if something goes wrong, we reverse it. You entrench interest, you then create new tension. So we've got to make every effort to get this decision right now, rather than try and put it right later. So it's got to be evidence-led. Evidence-led, not only globally, but also domestically. We have a growth rate of 0.5%. We've got unemployment at a 30-year high. That is the perception. That's the perception climate within which we want to proceed. And I would only say that with recognizing the socio-economic challenges of what the national minimum wage is all about. And I think it's absolutely correct that we should be discussing it, that this proposal has been put on the table, but we think the solution lies here, or that there will not be serious unintended consequences if we don't, in fact, take the right decisions. Then I think we're going to go from the frying pan into the fire. And I think that's the important point where we are now. And while I'm speaking, let me just add this. I'm a little bit concerned about the somewhat muted response from employers. It worries me on two grounds. Either they will not comply, in which unemployment won't rise as high as some people fear. They'll simply not comply, but they'll give the people jobs at a lower rate and hope that the inspectors won't catch them out. Or alternatively, they're quietly going to retrench or mechanize and not make a big noise about it. So I really think these are among the unintended consequences we will need to manage in making sure we arrive at the right decision about a national minimum wage in South Africa.
Well, thank you very much for that, Raymond. Professor Valodia, a whole host of points to respond to there. But let's start off with the way the panel factored in non-monetary compensation, because reading through the document, I didn't see all that much focus on things like employers paying transport money, accommodation, other non-monetary benefits to the employment package that actually may take the monetary level to way above the floor that you painted earlier.
No. I mean, we haven't really dealt with that, but it is an important issue because one of the problems we have in South Africa is if you kind of think about think about how much you have to spend to get to work, the fact that most of the workers live quite far from where they work, they have to pay all of the transport. They have to pay all of the transport. So the kind of amounts that you have to spend to sort of get to work is an important issue. But I just wanted to respond to a few of the questions that were raised. I think we can say a lot about what the impacts of this might be. I think the kind of approach that the sort of panel sort of took to the issue is that we were wanting to be driven by evidence. So let's not talk about theory and say this is what's going to happen. Let's look at the evidence. And there's three sort of bits of evidence that we drew on, which I think are quite striking. So the first is to look at the international evidence on the issue, and from across the world, what you learn from sort of countries that have introduced sort of policies of this sort is that you have exactly what we're having now. You have a huge uproar about the amount of jobs that are going to be lost. When you look at the evidence after, those projections about the numbers of job losses is simply not borne out. So, and why would that be so? It would be so because employers will respond in a number of ways to a rise in the wage. Some of them might think about decreasing employment, but there's a whole host of other things that you could do. So you could absorb it. You could find a way to manage it by reducing time. You could look at much more efficient ways to run your business. You could think about ways in which you can help the workers to be a lot more productive. So these adjustment processes are really, really sort of they manifest themselves in many ways, and it's simply not the case that the only response to a rise in wage is a fall in employment. That's not the evidence we take from the international world. In fact, many sort of countries where this has been done, in fact, you see a growth in employment. So I think one needs to be really circumspect about jumping to a conclusion that is not borne out by the facts. Let me say something about two South African examples that we drawn. So we've kind of had a minimum wage in the domestic sector for quite some for quite some time, domestic workers have had a minimum wage, and when it was first introduced, we had exactly what we're having now. You're going to hurt kind of really poor domestic workers. You're going to destroy their livelihoods. Have the events after that been kind of, have they proved these predictions or not? I think the evidence is overwhelmingly so. In the domestic work sector, we haven't had a fall in employment. In fact, we've had a transformation of work. If you think about what it was like to be a domestic worker, go back 20 years. They were the first to start their day, and they were the last to end their day. I think what we've seen in this time is a wage system that has regularized that work and has brought a lot of substantial changes to the way domestic work is done, and I think that has all been progressive. It's been
the agriculture sector doesn't bear that out, though, because we've had the opposite happen in the agriculture sector.
Absolutely. So where we do have evidence of job losses is in the agricultural sector, and why would that be so? Well, I mean, you could make the argument that the wage increase that we had there was so big that you'd not had the time to make the adjustment. And when we weighed up all of this evidence, what we took out of it was that the key to this thing is the way that you manage the adjustment process. And we've thought a lot about how we manage this process in a way that is going to allow the firms to adjust, that is going to allow employers to adjust. There's a long adjustment period. We've tried to create all of the checks in the system to make sure that we reap all of the advantages without having the job destruction.
And in terms of monitoring and compliance, because that was a point echoed by a few of the panelists tonight, is that if it isn't effectively policed, then all you're going to do is create this grey market for labour in the country, which we probably have here anyway. If you look at the reference wage price for immigrant labour, foreigners coming into this country don't have social security nets and that sort of protection, and they're therefore able and willing to work for far less. How do you plan to police this?
All right. So we think that you have to have the enforcement. You'll see in our proposals a strong suggestion that the Department of Labour should really improve all of the that there should be a substantial improvement in the way that we police the system. So absolutely, we can't have a system in place which is not going to be policed. But I think what let's come sort of back to the unemployment issue, right? Because we've had quite a few suggestions that the problem is that you've sort of got these 9 million unemployed, and that that setting the wage in the way that we have isn't appropriate. So I think you can turn that question around, right? So we've got earnings data that is really striking. 1/3 of those who have a job earn less than 2,500 rand a month. So if it's really the case that our unemployment problem is because the wage is too high, my question to those who make that argument would be, how low do you want this wage to go to make the labour market clear? If you really believe that the sort of labour market works like a fish market, then you should then you should push that wage lower and lower and lower. So how much?
Well, let's throw that out to the rest of the panel. Andrew Levy?
Yeah, look, I think, frankly, with respect, that's a spurious argument. I want to say two things. The first is we've got to be careful about relying too much on world evidence shows. We're dealing with a specific economy here. We're told in the one voice that it's got the highest or nearly the highest inequality in the world. We're told it's got one of the highest unemployment levels in the world. To compare us to any of the other countries with minimum wages is actually a false comparison, and I think it's a dangerous one. We've got to work out our own future here. And, one other thing, we say it's got to be evidence-led. Yes, that is true. But we've got to be very careful. I just have an overwhelming fear that this thing has been too quick. And it's been too quick because it became a political issue. Government stepped in. There'd been a long deadlock between the partners, the social partners at NEDLAC, and they were told, appoint a panel, get it done by XYZ date. I'm not sure that being under that pressure was, in fact, the best thing for us. And, we talk of unintended consequences. My experience of that is what we're really saying is we saw them at the time, but we didn't give them attention because we were trying to achieve other things or our eyes were elsewhere. Frankly, in a matter like this, there should not be unintended consequences. We need to canvass all of the arguments, look at them carefully, and I think to say with hindsight, oh yes, but that wasn't intended, is a large cop-out. The one thing I would say, which I think is positive, and I think the panel is to be congratulated here, is that there are two issues. The first issue is what is the absolute level of the thing. We've just dealt with that. But the second is the point where the way in which it's implemented is vitally important. And here, I think the panel have shown eminent good sense, and rather than to pick a date next week or the week after, to give a long run in is probably going to be as good as it would get. So I think that is a positive aspect.
So it will give employers time to adjust. Raymond, before we go to you, Mike, your response to what an appropriate absolute bottom would be?
Well, I think there's different bottoms. I didn't hear everything so clearly what Andrew said because the line is very weak. But I'd like to say this. I think in the majority of the formal sector, 3,500 will not be a problem. I think some of the people are paid well above that. A lot of people lie about their salaries when they're asked. That's also quite clear because the tax data and the salary data doesn't gel so nicely. The problem is when you get to something like domestic workers, and like Valoda said, Professor Valoda said, people adjusted. But I think the adjustment is not always as clear-cut. I think if you look at the Stats SA domestic wages, which they put into the inflation rate, it's been well below those wages that have increased by government. So either the people are lying about the wage that they receive, or they are working less. And I think it's a combination of the two. When people just don't have that money to afford the domestic worker anymore, they say, right, would you come in 3 times a week instead of 5 times a week? So the person still gets a relatively, the legal wage, but they don't necessarily work full-time anymore. And I think that's been one of the things that has been underreported, is that not working full-time in many aspects. What's also happened in the farming areas, which we also know, is that farmers have had to cut back on other costs. So what they've done is very simply said, okay, we used to pay your water and lights for you. We don't no longer pay your water and lights for you. We used to buy you so much maize meal for you and your family on the wholesale market. We don't do that anymore. So there are a host of other things, and the professor is quite right. That's what happens, how people respond. But it's not always positive. I want to say, I think for the formal sector it's fine. I think we should have thought a bit more about, I know we're going to give 90% to agriculture. Maybe it should have been 80%. Maybe it should be 70% for domestic workers, and maybe the security industry and one or two other industries, such as the personal care industry, should be relooked at. The other thing I want to say is that what nobody's mentioning is that people are buying jobs. Today, if you're a taxi driver, you rent the car. If you're working in a hairdressing, you rent the seat. And that means that you're actually self-employed in a way.
Yeah, Mike, you've raised a very good point.
That's all I'm saying.
Raised a very good point. Unfortunately, the one thing I've determined from this panel is that 45 minutes is certainly not enough to do justice to the debate, which is a very important debate to be having in the country, and at least we all sitting around the table having that debate. We've got the proposal on the table, and Professor Valodia, I'm sure it's not the final version that will be accepted. You're nodding your head there, so that's why this is so important. We're going to have to do something like this, I think, in the new year and give it a bit more time and go into some other areas that we didn't have time to address to you tonight. But thanks to all of my panelists for your contributions and for trying to find a better South Africa. I think we're all agreed on that point, at least at the end. NEDLAC Advisory Panel Chairperson, Professor Imran Valodia, in studio with Gerhard Papenfus, the Chief Executive of the National Employees Association of South Africa. And on the line we had employment labour consultants and law expert Andrew Levy, Professor Raymond Parsons of the School of Business and Governance at Northwest University, and Mike Schuster, Chief Economist at economist.coza. Tomorrow night, Anne Bernstein joins us along with former Mayor of Johannesburg, Parks Tau, to talk about whether cities can really and truly become the next engines of growth in South Africa. From me, Michael, producer Amor Klakla, and sound engineer Mdu Kele, thanks so much for listening. Good night.